Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're now into 2021, our new year. This is the first full weekend in January after the New Year's weekend. And we're going to start the Old Testament. As you remember, this is our Bible study from the Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio, that got moved to online because of the pandemic. And we've done the whole New Testament, which is available. You can go back and we did it book by book. And we're going to start on the Old Testament now. Now, this is very different. Old Testament is about 4 times the length of the New Testament. So it's much more comprehensive, much more lengthy, and therefore we're not going to do every chapter of every book like we did in the New Testament. Also, it really is much more comprehensive. The New Testament, in its writing form, covers a period of between 35 or 40, probably 50 AD through about 120, 60, 70, 80 years, and then it's been preserved from that time. The Old Testament historically covers a period of 1,500 years or so, and even later than that, and it's much more comprehensive. It's the history, the religious views, the legalistic structure, and the literature of this whole period of the Hebrew life from 1800 BC on up to about 300 BC. So it's extremely voluminous and very complicated. A lot of the stuff we won't get into. We won't go through the legalistic details in Leviticus and stuff, that those issues are not relevant to us now. But we're going to do the best we can. It's going to be kind of a survey, and we'll try to bring it into the modern context of what it means to us at this time. Now, the actual sources for the scripture are very different, and it's very complicated. So I'm going to try to do it as best I can. The oldest Hebrew texts in Hebrew of the Old Testament are 2 very ancient ones. Predominantly. One of them is called the Leningrad Codex. A codex is a book as opposed to a scroll. A lot of the Jewish churches even use scrolls now. They have an ark and they keep rolled up and stored in the ark. And on the scroll, you can only write on one side of the material, parchment or vellum, whatever you use. But in a codex, you can write on both sides, and you've put it into a book form. So the codexes began appearing around the time of Christ. And some of the most ancient texts are in codex because you can write on both sides of the material, and it's a lot more efficient. The oldest Hebrew text that's complete is called the Leningrad Codex. It was discovered in a synagogue in Leningrad in the old Soviet Union about 1930, and it's been preserved and it's in the museum there. The city is now called St. Petersburg, went back to its original Russian name, but it's still there. I've never been to Russia, and I'm never going to go, so I've never seen that one, but it's there, and it is used by modern biblical scholars as an accurate Hebrew text of the Old Testament. But it's not the oldest. The oldest texts of the Old Testament are in translation into Greek. Now, this is the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a translation into Greek of the Hebrew Scriptures, and people don't really know when and where. The assumption is it was about 250 BC, and it was probably done in the area of Alexandria in Egypt. That's presumption. That's probably correct. But that is the basis of the Greek Old Testament that's quoted by the apostles in St. Paul's letters and Peter's letters and the other quotes that are made in the New Testament. That really is this translation of Hebrew into Greek. And it's been preserved in modern form, and that's what the original translators into the European languages used. Martin Luther, the translators for the King James and Geneva Bible, the early translations, used the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the ancient Hebrew text. So they were into English or German translating a translation. And each time you translate, there's more risk, inevitability of not being as precise as you can. In translating is very, very difficult because the meanings on words change They change over time. They often have many different meanings. And so you're trying to decide, what did this word mean 1,000 years ago when this text was written versus what it would mean in modern Hebrew. If you're looking at the Leningrad Codex, what do these words mean now that were actually put into the text about 600 or 700 years ago? And a good example is if you try to read Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer, about 1400, a 600-year-old Middle English manuscript. To most of us, it's like reading a completely foreign language, and it shows how much a language changes over time. It's unclear when Hebrew became a written language. It was clear it was not a written language at the time of Moses, and whether it was even a distinct language at the time. Did the Hebrews, as they're fleeing Egypt, were they speaking their own language, or were they speaking whatever the language of Egypt was at the time if they'd lived there for 400 years? So when did Hebrew emerge as a written language? Most people presume, this is all presumption, that about 1000 BC, which is the time of the monarchy, King David, King Solomon, in that era. Because they found some small vessels or fragments of vessels with some what's called Proto-Hebrew, early Hebrew written on them. Now, early Hebrew, of course, didn't have vowels. It just had the consonants. So you had to put the vowels in yourself, presumably put them in. So you could get a different interpretation there as to where you put the vowels in. So there's always room for interpretation and to make mistakes. And the language, it evolved over time to where we get into the more modern manuscripts. So that between time of 1000 and 250 BC, when the Septuagint was translated, there's a lot of room for these texts to evolve in meaning. And the point I make about translation is it's very interesting. Recently, about a year ago, I read one of the biblical scholars was questioning the translation of Luke's gospel in the 2nd chapter about going to Bethlehem. And she said that she didn't think it really meant there was no room at the inn. She thought the word really meant house, that he was going to stay with his relatives. He was from Bethlehem originally, going to stay with his relatives, so their house was full, so they put him up at the stable, which was not unusual. People in ancient times often slept with the animals for the warmth, because the body heat coming off of the animals would make it warmer in a house where you didn't have any heat. You occasionally would have an open fire, but no heat. So sleeping in the stable wasn't all that unusual. And she thought that the term manger actually didn't mean manger, where it's sitting on the ground like our nativity sets have it, but it actually meant feeding trough, which should be located up on the wall. We had horses when I was young in West Virginia, and you would feed them by getting the hay up in the loft up above and scooping it down into the chute, and it would drop it into the feeding loft about head high for the horse, so they would keep the hay clean and off the floor where it would get soiled. And she thought it meant feeding trough. Now, these don't make any difference whether it was no room at the inn or no room in the relative's house, or whether the feeding trough or manger, but it shows the difficulty in getting your translations accurate. You can even put this into English, how you could debate over this one. If the term was from 200 or 300 years ago, it was manor, M-A-N-O-R, could that mean a hotel or an inn? Sure, it could. Even in modern times, we call things manors. But it also could mean an estate house, a nice house someone had. So that word can have two separate meanings. So you can have distinct meanings with subtle differences there. And even you look at modern English, words have many different meanings. The one I can think of, I'm certain there's a lot of other ones, is joint. What's a joint? Well, my elbow here is a joint where the two bones come together. And if you go underneath the sink, you'll see the water connection. There's a joint there where the pipes come together. A joint is also a marijuana cigarette. I'm not advocating that, but that's what it is. And a joint also is a term used for a bar, a lower class bar, maybe with a jukebox or small band or something. It's called a joint. And so this one word can have 3 or 4 distinct meanings, and as an adjective, you can have a joint agreement where two people come together, or more people come together and make an agreement. So it has lots of different wording. So if you came across a 300-year-old manuscript, what would it mean? So translating things is very, very difficult. I urge people not to get hung up on being literary. I remember Bible studies where people would say, this word means this. Oh, wait a minute, you're assuming that the translator got it correct and that the translator knew what it was meant 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So the ancient texts that we have are the two Hebrew ones, which are the Leningrad Codex, which is from 1010, I think they say, in Leningrad and St. Petersburg, Russia. That's the most complete. It's a complete Hebrew text. People are now using that for modern biblical translations. There is an older one called the Aleppo Codex, which is from about 900 AD, from Aleppo in Syria, and it was in the synagogue in Syria, and it was a complete text. But in 1947, there were anti-Jewish riots when Israel declared independence, and the local Syrian Arab community attacked the synagogue and burned it down, and they slipped the codex out, and it reappeared in Israel about 10 years later. But it's missing about 40% of the text, mainly the Pentateuch, the first 5 books are gone. Nobody knows what happened to them. Were they damaged in the fire? Maybe. Were they taken as souvenirs by the people that spent 10 years smuggling this out of Syria and into Israel? Probably that's what happened. A couple pages have appeared. They're probably still held privately, but those are the only two really old ones. That's supposedly on display in the Biblical Museum in Jerusalem, but I have not seen it, even though I've been to that museum. But the more ancient texts, the older texts of the Hebrew Bible that we have, are the Greek texts in the Christian writings. And they're from the Septuagint, which is, that I've shown you a copy of here. These things exist in modern life. And there's 3 major Christian manuscripts which have complete Old Testament and New Testament that have been dated from about 350 to 380 AD. So they're very, very old and very fragile. But there's 3 major ones. The Vatican Codex, which is in the Vatican Library. It's not on display. I've never seen it. You have to be, the only one person has complete access to the Vatican Library, and that's the Pope. They do let various scholars in, but you have to apply a special permission, and I'm certainly not in that category. And there's 2 in the British Museum, the Codex Sinaiticus, which was found tucked away in the attic of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai by some Russian Christian scholars in the 19th century, and it dates to about 350 or 360, and it has New Testament and the Old Testament, some extra books that didn't make it. It's an extremely important source of the original writings of the New Testament and Old Testament. And there was a Codex Alexandricus, which is also in the British Library in London, and that was found in Alexandria, Egypt, and it dates from about the same time. So it's interesting that the most ancient texts of the Old Testament that we have are Greek translations from the Hebrew into Greek, and they're preserved in the Christian literature. When you look at the more current Bibles that we used, this is the Vulgate, which is the Latin Bible that was used by the Catholic Church as their official text for a long time. And it was translated originally in about 380, 370 by St. Jerome. And he translated into the common Latin of the time, because Latin, like any language, has changed from the time of Julius Caesar, which is about 50 or 60 BC, to the time of St. Jerome, 400 years later. Remember how much we have to struggle to read Shakespeare and understand it, because the words are often very different. And when you read the notes about it, that Bible text has evolved over time as it was spread across Europe to be the official Latin Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. People kept updating the text to make it more understandable and more readable, so it kept getting altered as we went along. So, and the other source that people use sometimes is the Syriac Bible. This is a Syriac Bible. Syriac is the Eastern language of Aramaic. It's written in the Semitic script, reads from right to left. So the front of the book is what we would consider the back, and it goes from right to left. And this is a translation. This was translated about 180 AD as a Christian translation with the Old and New Testament. And again, when you use that as a source, you're going back to very ancient things in 180, but again, it's a translation of a translation. So my point I'm trying to make is it's very difficult to get the words exact and to understand exactly what they mean. So don't get hung up I've been in studies where people said this word means this and this word means this, as if it was written in English, because it wasn't. So look at the overall. the comprehensive, the overall thing. Don't get hung up in the details. This is kind of a little bit of a lesson. I grew up in West Virginia, where you had a lot of people who were literalists, who believed that God had dictated the Bible word for word in English. And if you come up with that belief and then you start studying this in detail, I've known a couple of people that shattered their faith to see how complicated the situation is. It doesn't shatter my faith at all. I understand human nature, and it shows that we really have to understand what we're studying and keep it in proper context and get the overall message from this, rather than getting hung up in the details. And even the most literalists have to interpret it, but that's what you do with the scriptures. You interpret it, and you bring your own biases, good and bad, with it. And a classic example of that interpretation was in the very famous Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee in the 1920s, when John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution in Tennessee, and it was regarded as non-scriptural, which it's not, and he was prosecuted for it. And as the defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, they wouldn't let him bring in his experts, and so he was allowed to put on the stand the prosecutor, who was William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was Democratic candidate for president 3 times, later Secretary of State. He was a true, honorable, honest Christian gentleman. He was a friend of my great-grandfather. And he's very strong in the literal Bible. So when Darrow was asking him on the witness stand about the creation, and he believed strongly in the first Genesis creation, even though there's a second creation and second Genesis we'll talk about later, and it was a world created in 7 days. He said yes, but he wasn't necessarily a 24-hour day. Darrow kind of steps up, kind of sits up and said it wasn't. No, not necessarily. So he was doing what everybody does. Even the most adherent to literal assumption about the text was doing what everybody does, interpreting it in a way to make it understandable and believable. So be flexible, be open-minded, try to learn as much as you can, and the purpose of this course is to try to give you a strong intellectual background as you can so that you can understand this along the way. Now I'm going to switch over and talk about the source of how the Old Testament was developed. The standard assumption now about the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the Old Testament comes in 3 classical sections. The Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The prophets, which start at Joshua and Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, which are more history than anything else, but running through all the prophets, Isaiah and stuff like that, down through Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the writings, which are the literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Lamentations, and then some odd books, Ezekiel and Daniel and stuff. They're all considered in the literature, the writings. When you look at the first 5 books, they're very complicated, and most people have, in studying it scholastically in the ancient language as best they can, they have determined that there apparently are 4 different sources that were provided the material for the first 5 books that are blended together beautifully in a way that presents a coherent text, but if you read it carefully, you can sort these out. What do I mean by blended? Well, most people assume this was work originally done by the Germans about 1850, and it's now standard teaching for biblical scholarship. There clearly were multiple sources, because Hebrew was not written at a time that Moses lived or Abraham lived or whatever. There appear to be 4 separate tracts. 2 of them were called Old Epic, and they're similar to each other. These were clearly the oral tradition handed down from the time of Moses until the writing began about 300 to 500 years later, when Hebrew became a written language about the time of King David. It depends on where you date Moses. I put Moses a little bit farther back than most people do. And they use 2 separate descriptions. They're 2 separate tracks. One of them is called the J source, and that uses the term Yahweh for God's name to refer to God, Yahweh. Because Moses asked, who am I to tell the Hebrews to send to me? He said, and the answer is, I am what I am, which is Yahweh in Hebrew. And so that's the J track, Yahweh. And they used the term Mount Sinai as the holy mountain. And that was the oral tradition of the southern community, kingdom of Judah, when the kingdom split after King Solomon died. And the other group is the E track, Elohim, which means Lord in Hebrew. And that was the tract of the northern kingdom. Now the Samaritans are the adherents of that. And they use Mount Horeb as the sacred mountain, which they say is now where Samaria is located rather than down in Sinai, as most people think. Those are the two old epics, and they were told around the campfire and taught and learned word for word. It's probably preserved very nicely as people pass this down. Remember that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were all done orally for several hundred years before, because Homer worked in a non-literary society before they were written down. So you can do this, and there are storytellers in the ancient part of the world who can recite these lengthy poetic things. Those were two sources. And then the third is the Deuteronomic historian, and that really appears to have been discovered and dealt with from the time of good King Josiah, about 640 BC. It was the kingdom of the southern kingdom, and he was a reformer. And he found this text, and it involves the history from Deuteronomy forward, and it has a formulaic approach that so-and-so was a good king, and God blessed him and did this and this and this. Other person, so-and-so was a bad king, and God disliked him, and blah. And the good people are rewarded and the bad people are punished. The problem with the history of that assumption is it isn't necessarily true. Some of the good kings like Josiah get killed young. Some of the very bad kings last a long, long time. But that was a formula of history, which is Deuteronomy, and it carries through the later histories, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings. And that's that compact of history. And the fourth is the priestly source. And the priestly source has a lot of ritualistic things in it. It has lengthy genealogies. It has lengthy rituals about worship and practice and this and that. And it's the four sources. They're blended together magnificently. But when were they blended? Well, you had this several very major episodes in the history of the Hebrews. Of course, you had the Exodus, which is pivotal. That what people look back with pride on having been slaves early in their origin and escaping. So the Exodus is really the pivotal event of the first 5 books. The second pivotal event, which was a really unpleasant one, was the conquest of Jerusalem about 595 by the Babylonians in the Babylonian exile, and the Hebrews were taken off into exile for 100 years or so. They drifted back over various amounts of time. And that exile is when the priestly community got together. They firmed up their belief. They cleaned up the belief system, and they put these texts together. So they blended these 4 texts together and blended them beautifully, that most people, without seriously studying it, don't see the blending or the different sources come together. But the scholars looking at it in the 1850s, looking at it very carefully, thought, wait a minute, you've got 2 separate creation stories here. You got Genesis 1, which is man is created last. That's the 7 days. Then you got a completely different story in Genesis 2, where man's created first. That's the Garden of Eden story there. That's the old epic tradition, and man is created first, and man helps God name the animals, and then you have the woman created, and that's the old epic. You have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you have expulsion from the garden, which is the old epic to explain why we don't have paradise right now. We're still living on earth with all the toils that we have. But they're again blended together very, very nicely, and you have two different stories about the call of Moses, 2 different stories about the covenant with Abraham, 3 separate stories about how King Saul was chosen to be the first king. 3 completely different stories. 3 completely different accounts as to how young David, prior to being king, made contact with King Saul. One is that he was selected by the prophet Samuel on a divine intervention. The second one was that he was going to visit his brothers who were in King Saul's army when they were lined up against the Philistines, and then David volunteered to fight Goliath. And that's the second story, independent one. And the third one was that he was a great musician who was brought in to play his music and sing to calm the enraged King Saul down, who was always in various fits of rage, some kind of mental illness. That's a third thing. And nobody knows exactly which of these is true, so they put them all together, blended them very nicely. So that's the background of the first 5 books. And a good example of how nicely it's done is if you look at the account of crossing the water. Because if you read the account of Exodus clearly, you know, in the Ten Commandments movie, which is nonsense, they have all this, they're all heroic, okay, all the Hebrew people. But you read the account before they cross the water and after, all they do is whine and complain and crab at Moses. We were better off in Egypt. We were safe there. They weren't after us. We had more to eat. You know, we're slaves, yeah. So they whine beforehand and they whine after, so they really weren't all that heroic. If you'd say, here's 2 walls of water and you got to go down between them, I don't think anybody would have done that, especially the Egyptians. So if you read it very carefully, you can see most likely what happened. God controls the natural forces and produces the miracle, but it's much more subtle. Miracles are actually much more subtle than people think. The angel of the Lord preceded them and then followed behind them. The cloud was dark. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh, the Lord, drove the sea back with a strong easterly wind all night and made the sea into dry land. Now these are in what we'll call the Bitter Lakes, and the canal's through there now, Suez Canal. But these were the Bitter Lakes. They were tidal lakes. The tide could come in and out, and onto dry land. He so clogged the chariot wheels of the Egyptian chariots that they drove on only with difficulty, which made the Egyptians say, let us flee from Israel. Well, so what happens is the tide goes out and the wind blows all night, and suddenly, where the low tide was still there, the wind had driven it back, and Moses wakes everybody up, get up, let's go. And they didn't have chariots and vessels and all that. They were just on their feet, and they had animals with them and all that. And they scamper across the mudflats. And then, let me see here. Then the Lord, in the returning waters washed right over the chariots and horsemen of Pharaoh's entire army, which had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not a single one of them was left. So they go out on the mudflats in their chariots. The chariots get clogged as they're heavy. They sink down to the axles. They're stuck there, and the wind stops, and the tide comes in 6 or 8 feet and drown them all. Nobody could swim. They all had armor on. The chariots were heavy, etc. So it wasn't Charlton Heston and 2 walls of water, but it was a true miracle and a believable miracle. And if you go through about every 4th or 5th verse, you find the old epic, which gives you the account of this. So this is a good example of what the scholars did when they went back through to sort all this. And so this is probably done in the Babylonian exile, because when the community comes back from Babylon, if you study the history of the community prior to the Babylonian exile, there's a constant struggle between the true believers of the Lord in the community to keep the community's religion free of corruption from the Canaanite religions of the fertility cults, Baal and Ashtart and all that, and to keep it and get rid of the idols, not have idols in the temple and all that, to keep the faith pure. And then you go into Babylonian exile, and when it comes back, they come back pure. They come back with a purging of the corruption of the fertility cults from the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonian exile, as bad as it was, served an enormous purpose in clearing the Hebrew community and making them true followers of the Yahweh faith, of the Lord's faith. And that's all part of this process. These various things happened to them. They had a third climactic event in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, and forced them into a completely different situation where they didn't have a temple anymore. They had to go to community worship, and the Pharisees took over and created modern Judaism, which is now Pharisaic Judaism. So you had these 3 pivotal events in the history of the Hebrew people: the Exodus, Babylonian exile, and the destruction of Jerusalem that have allowed the faith to structure to what it is now in modern Judaism. So this is a good example of how complicated the Old Testament is. I tried to explain it scholarly. I hope you all can bear with me and understand it. Maybe you need to back it up and listen to it again. But this is Dr. Guthrie. Next time we'll be talking into the we'll discuss the first part of Genesis, and then we'll move through this. We're not going to be in huge amounts of detail. We're just going to look at the major overall impact. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.